In the stillness of dawn, where snow drifts softly through the air, a mother cradles new life against her heart, her touch gentle, her gaze tender, her spirit unshaken. Beside her stands a warrior, strong and silent, his presence fierce yet protective. Two worlds, strength and softness, bound together by the cry of a child, the promise of a future that will outlive every storm. This is not just a family, it is the story of survival, love, and the unbreakable bond that even time cannot undo. The desert had never been merciful, and the night air carried a chill that seeped deep into the bones of anyone who dared walk it alone. She had settled herself by the hearth in her modest cabin, the crackling fire the only sound competing with the hush of the wilderness outside. It had been a day like many others, long and weary, with her hands sore from tending goats, patching fences, and gathering water from a distant spring. She was no stranger to solitude. It had become the only companion she trusted since the war took her husband and left her childless in the silence of the prairie. Loneliness hung over her like a permanent shroud, but she had learned to live with it, as one learns to live with scars. She had closed her eyes, almost surrendering to sleep, when she heard it, a knock. Not the confident knock of a traveler seeking lodging, nor the desperate pounding of bandits or soldiers, but a hesitant, weak rapping that seemed uncertain it even deserved an answer. She froze, her hand tightening on the old rifle propped against the wall, her heart racing. Out here, far from town, a knock at night was rarely a good sign. She crept to the door, every board of the cabin creaking beneath her bare feet, and listened. The knock came again, softer this time, almost pleading. Against every instinct to remain silent, she unlatched the door and pulled it open a crack. The sight before her robbed her of breath. There, on her porch, half collapsed against the railing, stood an Apache warrior. His long hair was tangled with dust and sweat, his face drawn and hollow, his skin stretched thin over sharp cheekbones. But it wasn't himself he seemed to care for. Clutched tightly against his chest, wrapped in a tattered hide, was a baby. The tiny form whimpered weakly, the sound so fragile it pierced her heart like an arrow. The warrior's lips trembled as he forced words past cracked lips. "Milk, please, my son." For a moment she stood frozen, torn between fear and instinct. The wars between settlers and Apaches had scarred everyone. She had seen raids, fires, deaths. She had been warned all her life that Apache men were ruthless, merciless. But this man's eyes told another story, eyes clouded with desperation, pain, and something she recognized far too well, the terror of losing a loved one. Her rifle slipped slowly from her grip until it rested against the wall again. She pushed the door wide and stepped aside. "Come in," she whispered. The warrior staggered across the threshold, nearly collapsing as he lowered himself to the floor. His arms, though trembling, never loosened around the baby. She crouched beside him, her hands shaking, unsure what to do. She hadn't held an infant since her own child was born still years ago, a grief she had buried so deep she no longer dared touch it. But the tiny cries tugged it all back, tearing through her heart until tears burned in her eyes. She reached out, her voice steady though her soul quivered. "Give him to me." The warrior hesitated, his grip tightening, a flicker of suspicion flashing in his weary gaze. But the baby whimpered again, and the woman's expression, soft and unwavering, seemed to melt the last of his resistance. Slowly, carefully, he placed the child in her arms. The moment she cradled the baby against her chest, something awoke in her, an instinct buried beneath years of emptiness. The infant's small hands brushed against her skin, searching, pleading, and her body remembered what her mind had long forgotten. She had thought her days of nursing were behind her, but as the baby rooted desperately, her breath caught. Nature, as if moved by mercy, answered the call. Milk came, warm and life-giving, and the child latched on, his cries silenced in the most primal exchange of love. She gasped, tears spilling freely now, as the Apache warrior lowered his head into his hands and let out a shuddering sob, the sound of a man who had carried too much pain alone. For what felt like an eternity, they sat in silence broken only by the baby's gentle suckling and the crackle of the fire. She studied the warrior through her tears, noticing the scars across his arms, the bruises, the exhaustion that clung to every line of his body. He had likely walked days through the desert with no food, no water, carrying nothing but his son. And here he was, not as an enemy, but as a father. The thought cut through the barriers that years of prejudice and fear had built inside her. She whispered softly, almost afraid of the sound of her own voice, "You are safe here. Both of you." The warrior lifted his gaze then, eyes glistening with gratitude he could not fully speak. He pressed a trembling hand against his chest and managed to rasp, "Mother." Then, motioning weakly to her and then to his child, he repeated, "Mother." She did not understand all the words of his tongue, but she understood the heart behind them. She looked down at the baby nestled against her, his tiny chest rising and falling steadily now, his lips curled in the faintest smile as he drank the gift she never imagined she still carried. Something shifted in her soul in that moment, a bond forged not of blood but of something far older, something as eternal as the land itself. She had thought herself barren not just of children, but of love, of purpose. Yet here, in the quiet of her cabin, fate had placed a starving warrior and his son in her path, and with one simple act, her life had been rewritten. The night stretched long, but she did not sleep. She rocked the baby gently, humming lullabies she hadn't sung since she was a girl. The warrior drifted into exhausted sleep beside the fire, his hand resting close enough to the child to touch if needed, even in dreams. She watched them both, her heart swelling with something she had thought lost forever. Tomorrow would bring questions, dangers even. What would the town say if they found an Apache man under her roof? What would happen if soldiers discovered him here? None of it mattered in that moment. All that mattered was the warmth of the child in her arms, the steady beat of his tiny heart against hers, and the unspoken vow she felt blooming inside her. She would protect him, no matter what. When dawn broke, the desert painted gold by the rising sun, she knew her life had changed forever. The woman who had once been alone was alone no longer. She had been given a son, and perhaps, in time, a family. The Apache warrior had come begging for milk, but what he left with was more than survival. He had found a mother for his child, and she had found a reason to live again. The sun had barely risen above the ridge when the woman stepped outside, the baby bundled in her shawl and pressed against her chest. The morning was crisp, a sharp wind carrying with it the smell of sage and dust. She breathed deeply, feeling the child stir, his small body warm against hers. Behind her, in the cabin, the Apache warrior stirred from sleep. She had expected him to vanish into the dawn, carrying his son away before anyone could discover them. But when she returned inside, she found him kneeling near the fire, carefully feeding twigs into the flames with the gentleness of a man who respected even the smallest spark. His eyes lifted to hers when she entered, and though they exchanged no words, a silent understanding passed between them. He was not leaving. At least, not yet. The baby had changed the rhythm of her days in an instant. Every few hours he cried, every few hours she nursed, and though her body ached from the sudden return of motherhood, she felt no resentment, only a fierce joy she could not name. The warrior watched closely whenever she cradled the child, his gaze steady, protective, almost reverent. At first, she thought it was suspicion, the fear that she might harm or take the boy. But slowly she began to see something else in his eyes, gratitude mixed with awe, as though he could not believe a stranger had given his son the gift of life. They did not share a common language, not fully. Her words were English, his mostly Apache, though he knew some scattered phrases he must have learned from traders or soldiers. Through gestures, pointing, and patient repetition, they began to piece together meaning. He told her his name, Kaya, and the baby's, Taji. She whispered her own name, Sarah, and for the first time in years, hearing it spoken aloud by another voice felt like a blessing rather than a burden. Slowly, haltingly, they began to speak, not fluently, but enough. He told her of his wife, lost to sickness when the boy was barely a moon old. He told her of the raids, the soldiers, the hunger. She told him of her husband, gone to war and never returned, of her empty cabin, of nights spent staring at the stars with no one to share them with. The days passed into weeks, and still Kaya did not leave. He mended her fences, fetched water, hunted rabbits and deer with a bow so silent she barely knew he had left until he returned with food. She found herself watching him as he worked, noticing the fluid grace of his movements, the way his strength was tempered by care. She had never imagined herself living under the same roof with a man like him, an Apache warrior whose people were branded enemies, yet he seemed less an enemy than anyone she had ever known. Taji thrived under their care, his cheeks growing rounder, his cries stronger, his tiny hands clutching at their fingers with a grip that promised survival. But outside the walls of her cabin, the world was less forgiving. Word traveled quickly in small towns, and though she rarely went into town, others passed near enough to see tracks, to glimpse movement. It was only a matter of time before a neighbor stopped her at the well and narrowed his eyes, muttering that he had seen a redskin skulking around her land. Her heart leapt into her throat, but she forced a calm smile, dismissing it as coyotes, as shadows. Still, she hurried home that day, fear clawing at her chest. When she told Kaya, stumbling over words and gestures, he only nodded grimly. He knew the danger. He had lived his life surrounded by it. That night, after Taji had fallen asleep in her arms, Kaya sat across from her by the fire. His voice was quiet, halting, but clear. Danger, soon. His hand rested on his bow, then pointed outward to the desert, then toward her. She understood. If he stayed, men might come. Men with guns, with hate. Men who would not see a father, only an enemy. Her heart twisted with the truth of it. Yet when she looked down at the baby sleeping against her breast, she felt a defiance rise up that surprised even herself. She shook her head slowly. No, she whispered, not without him, not without me. Kaya stared at her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes shimmered with something that stole her breath. He reached across the fire, his hand brushing lightly against hers. His fingers were rough, calloused, but the touch was gentle. She did not pull away. For a long moment, they sat in silence, two souls bound by a child neither of them had expected, by a love that neither had sought but both had stumbled into. The days ahead were tense. They kept to the cabin, moving carefully, listening for hoofbeats on the wind. When she went for water, Kaya shadowed her from a distance, unseen but always there. Once, while she nursed Taji in the shade of a mesquite tree, she caught sight of him on a ridge above, bow drawn, eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk. It struck her then how far they had come from that first night of fear. He was no longer a stranger begging at her door. He had become her protector, her companion, her son's father in all but blood. One evening, a storm rolled across the plains, lightning splitting the sky, thunder shaking the earth. She huddled inside with the baby, her nerves frayed by every crash. Kaya sat beside her, his calm presence steadying her. When Taji wailed at the thunder, she pressed him to her breast, rocking him gently, but her own tears mingled with the baby's. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm inside her heart, the fear of losing them, the fear of a world that would never accept what they had built. She whispered into the baby's hair, words he was too young to understand, I'll fight for you. Both of you, I swear it. When she lifted her eyes, Kaya was watching her, his face illuminated by the firelight. He didn't need to understand her words. The vow was clear, and so it was in that storm, with the rain lashing against the cabin walls, that Sarah realized the truth she could no longer deny. She was no longer alone, no longer barren, no longer a widow living on the memory of what she had lost. She had been given a new life, a son in her arms, and a man at her side whose presence had become as vital to her as breath. She did not know what the future held, whether it was months or years, peace or bloodshed. But she knew this, she would not let them go. They had come into her life as beggars, but they had become her family. And she would fight the whole world if she had to keep them.